In 2019, Charlotte County held its first ever One Charlotte, One Water Summit. Hundreds of community stakeholders came together to see what needs to be done in the future for Charlotte County water. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Spirillo. On this episode of Let's Talk Charlotte, we're going to sit down with Water Quality Manager Brandon Moody to talk about what Charlotte County is doing to improve its water quality. Welcome to Let's Talk Charlotte. On this episode, we're going to talk all things water with Water Quality Manager Brandon Moody. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Elizabeth.
So what is the county doing to monitor our waters?
So in June of 2022, Charlotte County embarked on its first county-wide water quality monitoring program. The whole idea behind it is threefold. Number one, it's to try to better understand how our waters in the county compare to water quality standards established by the state. Secondly, we want to better understand what is in our waters and what that does to the receiving waters, in other words, Charlotte Harbor, the Peace River, the Myakka River. So what are in the streams and the canals that exit Charlotte County, run through those lands, and enter into those waterways? And finally, what is happening in our backyards? We have a lot of folks that live along canals and waterways in our area, and there's oftentimes questions from them about, is the water safe? What is in the water? I see this sort of thing. Is that of concern? And so we've started monitoring those waterways to be able to better inform and answer those questions.
Now, how many monitors do we have in Charlotte County currently?
So right now we have 60 sites, and those are funded by the regional MSBU stormwater programs. So the Mid-County Stormwater Program, West County and South County Stormwater Program all have their own budgets that they provide to me to do monitoring within their regions. So the number will change over time as the budgets fluctuate, but right now we're starting with 60. And then in about a year and a half or so, we plan to review what we've done, determine if we're doing anything that's duplicative, if we're missing gaps, ways that we need to adjust where we're monitoring, what we're monitoring, and how, and change the program accordingly.
And what are you monitoring? What are you looking for in the water?
So we're looking at a whole host of things. You know, the big concern when it comes to like Charlotte Harbor and the tidal rivers is nutrients. Right now, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, which is the state agency responsible for determining if a water is impaired in Florida, has declared that much of Charlotte Harbor and the tidal piece of Myakka are impaired for nutrients of some sort. So one of the big questions that the county and our partner agencies have is, where is that coming from? And part of the need to answer that question then is to monitor what's in Charlotte County, coming out from Charlotte County into those waters. So we're looking at nutrients, what's in the nutrients of the waters that are going into those, the harbor and the rivers. We're looking at bacteria. Bacteria is always a big concern. We've had a lot of focus in Charlotte County about septic to sewer conversion, for example. And so we spend a lot of effort sampling for the various forms of bacteria, depending on the type of water, in order to determine if there are high levels that warrant further investigation and source tracking. And then we look at a lot of physical parameters that can impact aquatic life and health. So like oxygen, how much oxygen is in the water. Organisms in the water need oxygen to survive, and pollutants can impact that. So we take a look at that, and if we see issues, then we do additional investigation to determine what might be the cause. So it's a whole suite of physical parameters, nutrient parameters, bacteria, and biological, to help us kind of get as complete a picture as possible of the water quality story in those waterways.
And what happens when you find that a body or a canal of water is impaired?
So typically, the way that water quality monitoring improvement works in Florida is that agencies such as Charlotte County or regional agencies like the water management districts will collect water samples throughout their area. And then that data typically is submitted to the Department of Environmental Protection. And the Department of Environmental Protection has a whole suite of rules about how that data should be collected, what sort of quality assurance should be associated with it before they'll use it. And so we make sure that we adhere to those requirements. We submit that data to them. They then look at that information and determine if a waterway is meeting water quality standards. Again, those standards are established by the state. So if they're not meeting water quality standards, the state then declares that waterway to be impaired. Once that happens, there's usually a couple of different pathways that the improvement strategy can take. The traditional route is something called a TMDL, or Total Maximum Daily Load. This is a process driven by the Department of Environmental Protection. They develop these documents that basically determine what the source of the pollutant is that's causing the impairment, and by how much that pollutant needs to be reduced to make the water healthy again. So they implement that process, and then once they do that, they then work with stakeholders in the region to implement what's called a Basin Management Action Plan. And that's basically the blueprint for figuring out what activities should be done to reduce the pollutants to the levels required in the Total Maximum Daily Load document. So again, all of that process is driven by environmental protection. They do involve local governments and stakeholders to weigh in, but they're the ones that guide that process. There's a separate process now that has emerged in recent years called a Reasonable Assurance Plan. And this is a method by which the local stakeholders can take ownership of water quality improvement processes and derive their own plan. So everybody gets into the room and they determine what the sources are, what needs to be done, and who should do it. They all agree on those actions, and then that plan is submitted to DEP. DEP then will approve that plan. Provided they approve that plan, it becomes an actionable plan, like a Basin Management Action Plan, that the stakeholders are required to implement. So there's now kind of two paths that we look at. One is one that agencies like the county can help kind of push forward. The others is sort of on the schedule of the Department of Environmental Protection.
So one way is them telling you what to do, and another way is you saying this is how we want to solve the problem.
Correct. And again, the state still has to agree to it. It's not like they are completely out of the picture, but it does mean that the timeline is in the local stakeholders' court rather than in the state's court.
Right. Now, what is the foundation and the philosophy of the One Charlotte, One Water, that we look at all of water holistically and how it all connects?
So there's two parts to it. In one way, it's kind of acknowledging that water quality improvement and protection takes a community. It's not, the county alone can't improve and protect water quality. Individual entities alone can't. It takes the citizenry, it takes the county, it takes regional agencies, it takes everyone working together to acknowledge where there are issues and understand and agree upon what needs to be done to improve them. So the guiding philosophy behind the One Charlotte, One Water plan is to acknowledge that and to determine ways, mechanisms that we can involve all of these stakeholders to work together to protect our water resources. The other aspect of this is something of a blueprint. At the end of the day, the goal of the One Charlotte, One Water plan is to provide a suite of activities. That could be projects, that could be initiatives, that could be research, that moves towards both reducing water quality impairment issues that we have, as well as assuring that we don't have any more water quality impairments emerge.
Who are these partners in different organizations? Because I know there's a lot of them in this region that are all working on water quality.
Right. So for example, I know that the county really feels a lot of ownership with Charlotte Harbor. It is a place that everybody in the county loves, they enjoy, we recreate, we rely on a lot of tourism for there. Technically, Charlotte Harbor is not Charlotte County, it is state waters. And so the state and the feds actually have agencies that work down here to help protect water quality. So for example, the Department of Environmental Protection has the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves. They are a state entity whose sole focus is to evaluate, review, and support activities that protect Charlotte Harbor. The Southwest Florida Water Management District is required by statute to implement and maintain something called the Surface Water Improvement and Management Plan. So that is a plan for Charlotte Harbor and the waters that feed it, the Peace and the Myakka and Big Slough and those, to protect water quantity and quality for the harbor and those rivers. And then you have the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership. That's actually federal. EPA authorizes and partially funds the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership. And their drive is to do the same as these other two entities, the Aquatic Preserve and Southwest Florida Water Management District. The difference is that CHNEP actually has jurisdiction over a much larger area than those two entities. They focus on activities and projects to protect water quality, not just in the harbor, Harbor, not just in the Peace River, the Myac River, but also the Caloosahatchee. It's a very large scale and scope that they're involved in. But all of these groups, alongside local governments like Charlotte County, like Sarasota County, public interest groups, advocacy groups, all of these entities work together to identify issues, implement projects, and further goals related to water quality protection and improvement.
So water quality isn't just an issue that Charlotte County is dealing with, it's an issue that Florida is dealing with in different counties.
Right. This is water quality is at top of mind, I think, throughout many counties in the state. There are other areas that are seeing much more pronounced water quality impairment issues than we are. The Indian River Lagoon, for example, is in the news quite frequently lately. We all are aware of the issues facing manatee populations over there, the seagrass losses over there. So this is a Florida issue, and for that reason, state government over the last several years have devoted a large amount of funding, almost unprecedented amount of funding, for infrastructure improvement projects to better mitigate these water quality impairment issues. And that's going to be an important thing over the coming years because, as we all know, Florida's population is growing rapidly. A lot of areas that used to be green spaces are now becoming residential areas. They're now becoming commercial areas. So as Florida continues to rapidly change with this population growth, it becomes more important now than ever to really keep an eye on and keep our fingers on the pulse of what's happening in terms of water quality.
And now in the development in the past has actually caused some of the problems that we're dealing with now. So going to the future,
Right.
We're kind of now trying to look at what we're doing and how we're developing to kind of prevent those types of things from happening again, correct?
Sure. I mean, the ecology and especially wetland ecology, relatively speaking, is a somewhat newish field. It wasn't that long ago, really, even the 40s and 50s, that wetlands were seen as just basically this land that needed to be drained and conquered, essentially. There really wasn't any perceived value of that land. Now we know that wetlands are an extremely important part of the ecosystem. They're like the kidneys of the waters and nearby harbors and whatnot. And so now we know that it's actually very important to protect our wetlands and our marshes and whatnot. So as we gain more knowledge and more understanding about how these different systems provide services to protect water quality, so too does the science and the regulation evolve to help assure that those areas are protected and that we can improve water quality. Similar with stormwater management. Stormwater management design has improved by leaps and bounds since Charlotte Harbor or much of Charlotte County was platted out in the 50s and early 60s, all geared towards understanding that stormwater management has a role in protecting water quality. And so stormwater regulations like stormwater ponds and whatnot need to be designed to at least adhere to a minimum treatment standard to assure that we don't further degrade our waterways.
Right, and in Charlotte County, we have a lot of swales that move our water. Can we talk a little bit about the importance of the swales in filtering the water and moving water?
Sure. So swales serve two purposes. As much of Charlotte County, especially Port Charlotte, is resting on what used to be open marsh and pine flatwoods, which are areas that every summer would flood during the wet season and then in the winter would dry out. The ability to drain water, especially during that wet season, was especially important. So in general development, and a lot of these contractors came in the 40s, 50s, 60s to plat out these lands and design neighborhoods. These canals were built and the swales were built to facilitate that rapid drainage. Swales, though, serve another purpose. All of that vegetation in the swales actually serve to retain water in the contours of the swales, serve to retain and provide a little bit of treatment of that water before it gets into our canal systems. And it's important to remember that there's not a lot between us and the harbor. So water that runs off of people's yards that goes into those swales fairly quickly makes it into those canals, which then fairly quickly goes into Charlotte Harbor. And so it's very important to understand that those swales serve a purpose. I know that sometimes it can seem like those swales are just mosquito breeding grounds and why can't we get rid of that water faster and whatnot. But they really do help to protect and improve water quality within the region. And so the swales are actually vitally important, and the vegetation within them serves a role as well to uptake some of those nutrients as it's kind of moving through.
And how can citizens help this process or volunteer in helping water quality?
Sure, that's a question I get quite frequently. And the fortunate thing is that there are a number of existing opportunities for citizens to get involved for water quality. If they want to learn more, the Charlotte Harbor Environmental Center has a lot of outreach and education courses, some of which are actually funded by the county, that they provide to the public. So anybody that's interested to learn more about water quality in the harbor and in the county are invited to go check out the Charlotte Harbor Environmental Center. They also have a lot of volunteer opportunities. But even beyond that, there are other agencies that are doing monitoring programs, like the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves, which I mentioned earlier. They actually manage a volunteer water quality monitoring program where every month citizens go out on the first Monday and collect a water sample from their boats at various places within the harbor and in the tidal rivers. And that helps to go a long way to informing what's going on in the harbor in terms of water quality over time, because it's a program that's been going on for many years. The Florida Sea Grant has similar opportunities with their Eyes on Seagrass program. So Eyes on Seagrass was started a few years ago, and it's an opportunity for citizens to go out and actually do seagrass surveys with Florida Sea Grant. So for those that are interested in doing that, I invite them to go just do a quick Google search for Florida Sea Grant, and it's going to be right there for Charlotte County on the top of their page. Anybody looking for more information can also visit the One Charlotte One Water page. There's a link to Florida Sea Grant through that as well.
So there's a lot of ways that people can help.
Absolutely.
I mean, they really, if they're interested in it or they're concerned about it, they can be helped to really help clean up our waterways.
Right, right.
Now, what are some of the other things that we deal with our waterways, like red tide, and how is that playing into it?
Sure. So this is kind of a really important topic because, you know, as we have a lot of people moving down here, red tide is sort of a new thing for them. It's not something that most folks that come down here have experienced before, and so they have a lot of questions about it. And it's important to remember a couple things. Number one, red tide has been around for centuries. We have in the historic records documentation of the explorers back in the 1800s documenting red tide events on the shores. So red tide starts further offshore in the Gulf of Mexico. And there are certain drivers that we're still researching that causes them to upwell, and currents and wind then drive them towards the shoreline. There are various theories as to what exactly those catalysts are. But they're always present out there in the Gulf. One such theory, for example, has to do with Saharan dust. So Saharan dust has a lot of iron in it. And so there's one thought that there's bacteria in the Gulf waters that when that dust moves through it fixes the iron and thus allows nitrogen to get pulled in from the atmosphere. So nitrogen is all around us in the atmosphere. And when that bacteria pulls in nitrogen, enough of it that it can spur some of this growth and upwelling of red tide. So that's one such thought. But in any case, the population's upwell and they're carried over towards the shoreline. So that process happens outside of human influence. What humans can influence, though, is how bad the red tide can be once it gets here. Red tide is a cyanobacteria. It photosynthesizes and it uses nutrients to do that. So if we allow a lot of nutrients to get into water, to discharge into our waters in the Gulf and in the harbor, then the red tide can actually feed on that and propagate and get worse. And then it's this kind of cyclical effect, because what happens is we all know that if experienced red tide can result in fish kills because of the toxins that it produces. Well, when those fish break down, they reintroduce nutrients in the water that the red tide feeds on, and it then perpetuates. So eventually the red tide populations will die down, they'll go away. Again, there's still a lot of research being done to understanding the catalysts that cause that red tide to disappear. It's not that the nutrients are all gone. Other things happen that causes them to dissipate. But it should be noted that it's not unexpected to see red tide on any occasion. But we need to do our part to make sure that once they arrive, that we're minimizing our ability to feed them and allow them to propagate and get any worse than they otherwise could be.
Okay. What are some misconceptions that you've heard out in the community about water quality and what we're doing to improve it?
So I think really one of the biggest things that I've noticed since I arrived here in terms of trying to understand where we have impairments, why we have them, there's a tendency where I think everybody agrees where we have water quality issues that exist, but there's disagreement on why that's the case and where it's coming from. And it's not uncommon for individuals or groups to say, yes, we have a water quality issue and it's because of them. Or yes, we have a water quality issue because of them. And I think the reality is it's because of everything. Everything that we're doing plays a role. You know, whether it's fertilizers on landscapes and yards, whether it's commercial and industrial activities, they all play a role in introducing and impacting our waterways. And so really that's why, going back to our discussion about the One Charlotte, One Water plan, it's a plan that aims to involve all the facets of community in figuring out how we address our waters, because at the end of the day, it's going to take all of us. So we're all a contributor in some fashion, and therefore we all need to work together to figure out how we're going to make things healthier and keep them healthy.
Thank you for joining us today, Brandon.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Let's Talk Charlotte. If you would like to know more information about One Charlotte, One Water, you can visit charlottecountyfl.gov and search One Charlotte, One Water. For CCTV, I'm Elizabeth Spirillo.